Welcome back. In the previous lesson, we created the foundation for our authentication module. Now let's go ahead and start to build upon it. Now let's create our first component. Let's start with the sign in. In order for us to communicate with Firebase, we need to install the Firebase Sdk, and we're going to use a package called Angular Fire. That's the official Angular wrapper for the Firebase Sdk. So in our terminal, let's add those two packages with yarn add Firebase and Angular Fire 2. Now that we've installed the package, let's go ahead and add it to our application. Let's import the Angular Fire module from Angular Fire 2. And in here, let's initialize the Firebase with the environment key we created before. We also need to import the packages we're going to use. We're going to need the Firestore, which is the Firebase database. We're going to also use the storage module and the authentication. We're going to add it to the core module. And these are the imports. And let's add it to the imports array. Now we initialize the Angular Fire 2. Let's start to create our service. A service in Angular is what communicates with a third-party provider like Firebase in our case. We will need to import a router so we can redirect users after login or registration. We're also going to import the Firebase auth and the Firebase database Firestore. We will also need observable and a switch map operator, and I'll show you why in a bit. Let's create an interface to use it with TypeScript. And here we're going to create a user observable and link it to this user. So in the constructor, let's initialize the Angular Fire auth. We'll call it AF auth. Also the Angular Firestore and the router. Now here in the constructor, we're going to create a method that will check the auth state, and we will return a Firestore document if there is a user authenticated. So let's create it now. The user observable, use the auth state, and we're going to use the switch map to check if there is a user, and we're going to return a Firestore user document. And here we're going to use the ES6 string interpolation to create a path where the user data is going to be stored. And then we're going to watch for changes. If there is no user, we're going to return an observable of null. So in here, we are returning a Firestore document for a user under a user's collection, and here is the user ID that will be created by Firebase, and we're going to listen for value changes. And if it's not, we're going to return null. So now that's done, let's create a sign-in method. This will take an email and a password with both string type and we return the sign in with email and password method that comes from Firebase. We'll pass the email and password. Now this is a promise. So after it's done, we're gonna console log the result. Have successfully signing. And if there be errors, we're gonna catch the error, and we're also gonna console log. We're gonna console log the error message. Okay, now let's create a sign out method. This will return a signout method from Firebase. Sign out. And when it's done, we're going to send the user back to a home page with this.router.navigate, and we're gonna send them to the root of our app. We're done with auth service. Let's go to our sign-in component and let's start building our form. To create our form, we will need to import the Angular form modules and the reactive form module. So let's import it into our share module. And here we're gonna import and export it. Just like that. We're also gonna use the material module, so let's import it in here as well. Okay, remember to keep it in alphabetic order, just so we can keep it organized. Back in our sign-in component, we're going to import the form group, form builder, and validators from Angular Forms. We're also going to need a router, observable from IRxJS. We're going to import the share module and the auth service. Let's create a sign-in form. And that will be a form group. In our constructor, let's initialize the form builder, authentication service, and the router. Here we're going to use a public, and the difference is that public you can use in your HTML, and private, it's only if you're going to use it in here in the component.ts. Here can be private. Let's create our form. First, we make a reference to the sign-in form. Let's call the form builder user group. And here you have an email and a password. The first argument is the input value. We're going to leave it empty to start, and then we're going to pass the validators. Here we're going to check if it's an email, and also let's make it a required. So now the password, the same. Let's start with an empty input, and let's add some validators. We're going to use a pattern in here. This will try to match the user input with this pattern. And here we are trying to check if there is numbers and letters in the password. If the user input matches with this pattern, it's allowed. We also can add a minimal length, maximum length, and you can add as many as you want. You can even create your own. Now let's create some getters to retrieve the information from the sign-in form. And the reason you add in these getters is so we can use only email while they're referencing the form input. Let's add one for the password as well. And here, if you click and select, you can add both together. Now let's make a function to call the sign-in method from the authentication service. And we return that method. Email sign-in, and here we're gonna give the email value and password. After, we're going to get a user, and if the form is valid, we're gonna navigate it to the home page. The sign-in form is valid. Get the router, navigate. Now our backend part is done. Let's just add one more thing in here, and I will tell you in a bit what is it for. Is the hide equals true. Let's go to our signing component.html and we'll start creating our user interface. But before, let's start the server so we can see what we are doing while we're coding. Let's navigate to the signing. So now we start our server and we're getting this error. And the reason is that form builder and validators, they come from the Angular reactive form module. We've imported into the share module, but we haven't added that share module in here. So we need to import it. From OneUp, shared module. Now if you add it to our imports array, the error should be gone. Let's navigate again to the signing, and it works. Now we are ready to start to create our signing. Here we're gonna add a main and a section, and this is for CSS purposes. Let's create a form. We don't need the action. We're going to use the form group we create, which was the sign-in form. There. And we're gonna use the ng submit directive. And we're gonna call the sign-in. There. Let's give it a h3. I'll come back. Into your account, and we're gonna need some Material Angular module. Let's go to the Material Angular website, components, and let's get the input. Here, we need to import this. Back in our app, let's add it to the Material module. That should give us access in here. That's a mat form field. We also need to pass the form group in here in the form field. Let's add an input. We don't need a type. This mat input comes from Angular Material. Let's just give it a placeholder and a form control so we can access its value. And it's also a required. Here, let's add a mat error. And the validation, we're gonna use the ng if. If the email is valid, we'll show this message in here. Now let's do it the same for the password. Just clicking, so I can select all of them. Everything's changed. Now the reason we add that hide in the component, this one, is that we're going to toggle the password in here with show password and hide. And for that we need to add the icon. And inside is gonna have a JavaScript ternary operator. If the hide is true, it will return a visibility icon. And if it's false, it will show the visibility off icon. Let's give it a mat suffix so it stays in the right side of the input. And also let's give it a click event. This will toggle hide true and false. Let's test it. And that doesn't work because we need to add the type in here. At the moment is a normal input. So let's add a type. And this is also a ternary. If it's true, it's going to be a password input. Or if it's false, it's going to be a text input. So true, password input. Toggle, false. Yeah. And that's how easy it is to do a show and hide password with Angular material. Now let's just add a button and it will be ready to test. Button is mat raised button. This comes from Angular material, type submit. And let's change the color to accent. Okay. Now let's give some CSS. Gonna tag the main and give it a display grid and align the items in the center. Grid template rows. We're gonna make it 100%, 100 view height. Now the section. Let's give it a max width of 600 pixels and margin auto. Now it's vertical and horizontal align. And that's how easy it is to create a layout with CSS grid. Let's just give the mat form 100% width. Now that looks much better. Let's do the same for the bottom. So let's go ahead and test it. But before we need to go to the Firebase console, authentication tab, and the sign-in methods. In here there is a list of the providers. Let's enable the sign-in with mail and password, which is the function we created. And let's also add the Google while we're here. Now here under users, let's create a user so we can try it out. Now back in our app, let's try our it works, sign in, and it worked. Here if you go on the applications tab, under local storage, you can find the user object that Firebase created. And we've been redirected to our home page. So that's great. We finished this section. Next we're going to give the users the ability to register in our application. See you in the next lesson.